Picture this: a sleeping donkey, a broken dam, a bathtub floating down a flooded Arizona street. Somehow that chain of events ended up as an actual law. Arizona has 10 of these still active right now, and number 1 could put you away for 25 years. At number 10, we have the town of Kingman, Arizona, and the story behind the law that started it all. A rancher had an old bathtub sitting outside on his property. Nothing special about it. His donkey had simply decided it was a comfortable place to sleep. The donkey used that tub regularly. Nobody thought much of it. It was just a quirky habit on a private property. Then a nearby dam broke. Floodwater came in fast, swept across the land, picked up the bathtub, and carried it downstream with the donkey still inside. The rescue that followed cost real money and real effort. Officials had to track down a bathtub floating through a flooded basin with a very disoriented animal in it. When it was over, local authorities started asking how something like that should have been prevented. The conversations that followed touched on animal safety, private property, and what responsibilities a landowner has when their animals become a public emergency. Whether a fully written ordinance ever made it into formal code is something legal researchers have gone back and forth on. But the story itself is well documented. It is not an urban legend. It is historically connected to real policy discussions happening in early Arizona communities at the time. A flood, a bathtub, and a confused donkey actually changed the way officials thought about animal regulation. That is the thing about this story. It became the symbol for how laws get made. Real life tosses something so completely absurd at a town that the only logical response is to sit down and write a rule about it. Arizona has been doing that ever since. And if you think number 10 is strange, every single entry on this list is going to push that further. These are not folklore. These are in active city and state code right now. Number 9 is where things start getting genuinely uncomfortable. Coming in at number 9 is the city of Avondale, Arizona, where fortune-telling is a criminal offense, not just charging money for it, doing it at all. Even if the reading is completely free, telling someone's fortune in Avondale can result in a misdemeanor charge. The ordinance is Section 15(1) of the Avondale City Code. It covers fortune-telling, palm reading, and palmistry in full. All of it banned. There is one narrow exception written into the law, and it is not what you would expect. Hypnotism is technically allowed in Avondale, but only under one specific condition. It has to be performed by a licensed medical doctor or dentist for a legitimate medical purpose. That is the only carve-out the ordinance provides. Everything else stays illegal. The law is believed to have been introduced during Arizona's early growth years, when traveling performers and self-proclaimed mystics were moving through small communities regularly. Towns like Avondale had to decide what kind of visitors they wanted settling in. Whether the goal was protecting residents from fraud, or simply keeping wandering fortune-tellers from setting up shop in town, the effect was the same. The ordinance went into the books, and it never came out. It is still sitting there in Section 15(1) right now. Think about what that means practically. A birthday party where someone reads palms as a joke. A carnival booth at a community event. A friend who claims to see the future. All of that is technically a criminal act inside Avondale city limits. Number 9 is strange. But number 8 is going to show you that Arizona takes things a step further when it comes to public behavior, and the penalty attached to this one will stop you cold. At number 8, we have Goodyear, Arizona, and a law about spitting. Specifically, under the Goodyear Code of Ordinances section November 1st, 15, it is unlawful for any person to spit on public sidewalks, crosswalks, parks, highways, or inside any public building. Any of them. The penalty is not a small slap on the wrist. A violation of this law can result in a fine of up to $2,500, or up to 6 months in prison, for spitting on a sidewalk. That is not a typo. That is the actual code. The origin of this law goes back to the late 1800s, when public health officials across the country started making a direct connection between spitting in public and the spread of disease. The disease at the center of that conversation was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was spreading through American cities at a frightening rate during that period. Doctors and health officials identified public spitting as one of the primary ways the bacteria moved between people. Anti-spitting laws started appearing in cities nationwide as a direct response. Goodyear adopted its version and attached serious teeth to it. The fine and prison time were meant to make sure people took it seriously. At the time, this was considered a genuine public health measure, not an absurd overreach. The problem is that the law never got updated. The world moved on. Tuberculosis stopped being the public crisis it once was. But Section November 1st, 15 stayed exactly where it was, penalties and all, still sitting in Goodyear's active code today. 6 months in prison for spitting on a sidewalk. That is number 8. Number 7 is going to take us to Tucson, Arizona, and a law that tells women specifically what they are and are not allowed to wear in public. At number 7, we are in Tucson, Arizona, where a city ordinance still on the books prohibits individuals from wearing clothing considered inappropriate for their gender. Under the letter of this law, a woman wearing pants in Tucson could technically be charged with a misdemeanor. That is not a loose interpretation. That is what the ordinance says. Clothing deemed not appropriate for the wearer's gender is a violation, and pants on a woman by the standards of the era when this was written fell squarely into that category. Legal experts and city officials in Tucson have acknowledged that this law exists. They are also clear that it carries no practical weight in modern enforcement. No officer is going to write that citation. No court is going to hear that case. But the law itself has not been removed. That is the part worth sitting with. It is not that someone forgot it was there. People know. The city knows. And still, at some point the decision was made that pulling it from the books was not a priority worth the effort of a formal repeal process. This happens more often than most people realize. Municipal codes across the country are full of relics that nobody enforces, but nobody officially removes either. Repeal requires legislative time, effort, and a vote. Ignoring it costs nothing, so ignoring it is usually what happens. The Tucson Pants Law is one of the clearest examples of how deeply social norms once became embedded in formal city code. What was considered a matter of public decency in one era becomes an embarrassing footnote in another, and yet it stays right where it was written. Number 7 is a law about appearances. Number 6 is going to take us to Prescott, Arizona, where the frontier era left behind one of the most specific and genuinely entertaining laws in the entire state. Coming in at number 6 is Prescott, Arizona, and a law that prohibits riding a horse up the steps of the courthouse. According to Arizona historian Marshall Tremule, this ordinance was a direct response to an era when cowboys regularly rode their horses straight up to public buildings, and sometimes inside them. That was not unusual behavior on the frontier. Horses were transportation, and riders did not always feel the need to dismount just because they had arrived somewhere official. Public buildings were not automatically off-limits to a man on horseback. So Prescott wrote a rule. You cannot ride your horse up the courthouse steps. That's specific, not a general ban on horses near the building, not a prohibition on animals inside city limits. Just the steps. Riding up the steps is where the law draws the line. Here is what makes this genuinely funny. The law technically allows a horse to be brought into the courthouse lobby. Walking a horse through the front door and into the building was apparently common enough that it did not require its own restriction. Only the steps needed a rule. Think about what that tells you about life in Prescott during that era. The lobby was fine. Horses in lobbies was a solved problem. It was specifically the steps that kept causing issues, so the steps got addressed. That is frontier lawmaking in its purest form. You do not write broad sweeping policy. You write a rule about the exact thing that happened last Tuesday that caused a problem. The Prescott Courthouse Steps Law is a direct snapshot of everyday life in the Wild West. Number 6 is fun. Number 5 is where things shift back towards serious, because this next one is a statewide law with real teeth behind it, and a reason that actually makes sense once you hear it. At number 5, we have a law that covers the entire state of Arizona. Under Arizona Revised Statute 32664, it is illegal to feed garbage to swine without first obtaining a permit from the state's Associate Director of Agriculture. The permits must be renewed every January without exception. There is one carve-out in the law. A person can feed their own household garbage to pigs they raise solely for personal use. That specific scenario is allowed. But the moment you are running any kind of larger operation using waste as feed, you need that permit in hand. This law was not written to be absurd. It came out of a genuine concern about food safety. Feeding animals unregulated waste exposes them to bacteria, pathogens, and toxins. Those things do not stay in the pig. They move into the food supply, and eventually onto someone's plate. The permit requirement was designed to make sure that any operation using garbage as pig feed was doing so under proper oversight. Someone with authority had to sign off on it. Someone had to be accountable if something went wrong with the animals or the meat they produced. That is a completely reasonable public health framework. The fact that it sounds strange when you read the headline is a function of how it gets described, not what the law actually does. Arizona just wrote it plainly and specifically and left it sitting exactly where it was. The permit renewal every January is the detail that stands out most. It is not a one-time registration. It is an annual check-in with the state. Someone at the associate director level is looking at these operations on a regular basis. That is more rigorous than most people would expect. Number 5 turns out to be mostly sensible once you get past the headline. Number 4 is going to take us somewhere nobody expected, because this next Arizona law is about arcade machines, and it is completely specific in a way that will make your brain stop for a second. Coming in at number 4 is Arizona Revised Statute 13-3312, and it makes tampering with a claw machine a criminal offense. Specifically, rigging the claw in a way that physically prevents it from being able to grasp a prize is against the law in the state of Arizona. The statute also prohibits misrepresenting the value of prizes inside the machine. If the prizes are advertised or displayed in a way that suggests they are worth more than they are, that is a violation. Using cash as a prize inside a claw machine is also banned outright. This might sound like the silliest thing on the list so far, but there is a real consumer protection framework behind it. Claw machines in Arizona are technically classified under gaming regulations. They are not just toys. They are regulated entertainment devices with legal obligations attached. Deliberately rigging the claw against players is not just bad business practice. Under Arizona law, it crosses into fraud. You took someone's money, you gave them a machine that cannot function as advertised, and you profited from the gap between what they expected and what they got. Arizona decided to address that directly with a specific statute rather than relying on broader fraud language to cover it. That is actually a fairly sharp legislative move. It removes any ambiguity about where the line is when it comes to these machines. It also makes Arizona one of the very few states in the country with dedicated claw machine legislation still active on the books. Most states either never wrote one or quietly let it lapse. Arizona kept it, and it is still sitting in the revised statutes right now. Number 4 is about arcade fraud. Nobody talks about. Number 3 is going to take us to one of the most famous towns in American history, and the law there is one of the most specific appearance-related rules you will find anywhere in the Southwest. At number 3, we are in Tombstone, Arizona. The town made famous by the gunfight at the OK Corral, and Tombstone has a reported ordinance that says men and women over the age of 18 must not have a missing tooth visible when they smile in public. Read that again. If you are smiling in public in Tombstone and someone can see a gap where a tooth should be, you are technically in violation of a city ordinance. The law applies to both men and women above 18. It is an appearance standard written into municipal code. The intent behind this law appears to have been connected to the town's image. Tombstone built its identity around a particular rugged frontier character, but city officials apparently decided there was a line between rugged and visibly neglected. Missing teeth and public smiles landed on the wrong side of it. Tombstone historically attracted drifters, outlaws, and rough-edged travelers passing through. The town had a reputation. Some officials wanted to manage what that reputation looked like on the streets. A smile showing missing teeth apparently became part of that conversation at some point. Whether this ordinance is enforceable by modern standards is a separate question entirely. The practical answer is no. No officer in Tombstone is stopping someone on the street to inspect their smile for gaps. That is not happening. But the language in the code has not been formally removed. It sits there as one of the most uniquely specific appearance-related ordinances in the American Southwest. Not clothing, not hygiene in a general sense. Just the visibility of missing teeth during a smile. Someone in a room somewhere voted yes on that, and it became law. Tombstone is already one of the most unusual towns in America by reputation. Number 3 just confirms that the reputation is well earned. Now we move to number 2, and this one is a statewide felony with a legal logic built into it that will genuinely catch you off guard. At number 2, we have Arizona Revised Statute 13-3453. Under this law, manufacturing, distributing, or possessing with intent to distribute an imitation-controlled substance is a Class 6 felony. That includes fake cocaine. Making or selling fake cocaine in Arizona is a felony offense. That part is unusual enough on its own. But there is a specific clause buried inside this statute that takes it somewhere completely unexpected. A person cannot use as a legal defense the argument that they believed the substance they possessed was real cocaine. Pause on that. If you are caught with fake cocaine in Arizona, and you tell the court you thought it was real, that argument does not protect you. Claiming you believed you had the actual drug does not shield you from prosecution for having the imitation version. The legal reasoning behind this clause is actually tight. If believing you had real cocaine were a valid defense against the imitation charge, anyone caught with fake cocaine would simply claim they were confused. The clause closes that door completely before it can be opened. The law was designed to address the market for counterfeit drugs, which carries real dangers. A buyer who purchases what they believe is cocaine and receives an unknown substitute faces its own set of health risks. The seller profits either way. Arizona decided both scenarios deserved the same criminal weight. What makes Statute 13-3453 stand out is that it layers multiple logical pieces on top of each other and still arrives at something that sounds completely bizarre when you read the headline. Felony charges for fake cocaine cannot claim you thought it was real. Both true. Both in the code. Number 2 is legally tight, but genuinely strange sounding. Number 1 is the one that makes everything else on this list feel minor. Because number 1 carries a sentence that most violent crimes in this country do not reach, and it is about a cactus. At number 1, covering the entire state of Arizona, cutting down a saguaro cactus without a permit is a felony offense. The penalty is up to 25 years in prison. That is not a fine. That is not community service. That is a quarter century behind bars for cutting down a plant. To understand why that number exists, you have to understand what a saguaro actually is. These cacti can live for over 150 years. They grow at a rate that makes almost every other living thing look fast by comparison. In their first decade, they might gain just an inch of height. A saguaro does not grow its first arm until it is somewhere between 50 and 75 years old. That arm you see sticking out of the side of a cactus in every Arizona postcard took longer to appear than most human lifespans reach. These are not replaceable plants on any human timescale. They are also not just scenery. Saguaros provide shelter and food for dozens of species of birds, insects, and mammals. Woodpeckers carve into them. Owls move into those hollows. Bats feed from their flowers. Pull one saguaro out of the ground and a small ecosystem loses a critical piece. For years people shot at them, carved into them, and pulled them out of the desert to use as landscaping. Some were destroyed purely for sport. Others were taken commercially and replanted in private yards or sold. The losses were adding up, and they were not recoverable on any timeline that mattered. Arizona passed strict protections in response. The 25-year maximum was not written to be dramatic. It was written to be a genuine deterrent to anyone who thought the consequences of destroying one of these ancient plants were worth the risk. The severity of the penalty was the entire point. So there it is. A donkey in a bathtub started the list. A 150-year-old cactus ends it. 10 laws that look absurd on the surface until you trace each one back to a real moment, a real problem, and a room full of people who decided to write it down.